Hello, this is John from caveofprogramming.com. In this tutorial, we're going to take a look at MySQL database engines. So, although this is not a tutorial on MySQL database administration, it is a tutorial on using MySQL as an end user and on learning SQL and working with a MySQL database. Nevertheless, there are some configuration options that affect how MySQL works. So before we go any further, we're going to have to take a look at some configuration related stuff because you're going to need to know that in order to predict how your queries are actually going to work. So I've already typed use tutorial 1, but there's no harm in typing it again. So we're using the right database. And now I'm going to type show engines and execute that. Now, what a MySQL engine is it's a module, a part of MySQL that deals with your SQL and constructs tables, basically. I'm not sure if the actual code that parses your query is part of the engine, but certainly the part of MySQL that constructs tables and decides what they can do and what they can't do. That's called an engine. And MySQL supports various different engines. Now, most of these I haven't used, but there are two really important ones that you should know about. Historically, MySQL, as I remember it, this is according to my memory, and I've been working with MySQL probably since around 1999, I think. Historically, MySQL was built around, and I don't know how to pronounce these names, but I'll make up a pronunciation. It was built around this MyISAM engine. Now, it was a good start, but it didn't support some really important features of databases. It didn't support, as I remember it didn't support transactions, and I presume still doesn't. It didn't support foreign keys even, which, as we'll see later on, are really important to use. So it was a big step forward later on when MySQL came out with this InnoDB engine, which does support transactions, does support foreign keys. And if you do show engines, hopefully you'll see that InnoDB is set to the default. Now, it is possible to change which engine you use, and you're probably not going to want to. For this tutorial, you're going to want to make sure that InnoDB is the default engine, unless there's something even newer and better that's come out since this tutorial, in which case you could switch to that. But in this tutorial, we're going to be using the InnoDB engine. It is possible to specify on a table-by-table basis which engine your table uses. And again, most of the time, that's probably going to be pretty useless. But it's quite common that if you see a SQL script that's intended to be executed to create a complete database, after every table it will specify which engine each table is using, and it's normally going to be the same engine every time, and it's normally going to be InnoDB. So in case you see that in a script, it's kind of important to know about. If we type in here show table status, we can see which engine each of our tables is using. We've only got one table at the moment, and it's using the default InnoDB. But I could change that, and there are a number of ways I could change it. So let's create a table. Let's call it test, and I'll give it just one column. So let's say ID int, and I'm going to say next, after this bracket, I'm going to say engine equals, and pick a different engine. So the only one I've actually used is this MyISAM. So let's go ahead and try that. So I've executed that, I've created the table, and now let's look at show table status. And we see that we've got a test table using this MyISAM database. I'm going to delete that for the moment. Let's say drop table test, and we'll see another way of doing that. So another way you could do this is you could set the default storage engine for your session. So you could say set default, this is right, I think, set default storage engine equals MyISAM. Let's try that, looks good. And now let's do show tables. So there are the tables. Just to remind ourselves, we've only got one table now called users. And I'm going to do show table status. Okay, that's good. And let's also do show engines. So we see that this one table we've got users is using InnoDB as we saw before. Let's do show engines. Now we can see that my ISAM is set to the default. So we'll try creating another table. So create table, I'll call it test again, and we'll say it's just got one column ID. And I won't specify a storage engine, so I'll execute that. And then we'll do show table status. And now we can see that the default really has been changed to my ISAM, as we also saw when we did show engines. Struggling to remember because these are commands that I very infrequently use. Most of the time you don't need to bother with this, but I just want to show you this so you kind of are familiar with it and you're not puzzled if you come across it. And you do want to make sure with show engines, you do want to make sure that InnoDB is set to the default. So let's set InnoDB back to the default. Let's say set default storage engine equals InnoDB. I don't think the capital letters make a difference there, but I'll put it all in capitals because that definitely works. And then again we'll do show engines, and now we can see, yeah, InnoDB is back to the default. Now let's say you've got MySQL installed and you find you're using, it's a recent version of MySQL, so it supports InnoDB, but for some crazy reason you find that it's using MyISAM. You can change it in your session as we've just seen, or you can specify it after every table that you should use InnoDB if necessary. If you're the administrator of your MySQL server yourself, you can also change this in the config file. So this is kind of taking us a little bit away from the point of this course as a whole, but I'm just going to demonstrate that quickly. So if you look in the MySQL folder, you'll find there's a mysql.cnf if you're using Linux or some kind of Unix type system like the Mac, and it's probably going to be called .ini if you're using Windows. Now, although this is present in my MySQL installation folder here, in fact on the Mac, and you would have to check this if you want to do it for Windows, you have to check where the default location of this file actually is, because it's actually not here. This isn't the one that's actually being read on my system, which is a Mac. So let's go to a terminal now. And again, if you're not familiar with the terminal, really don't worry about it, because this is taking us off the main point of this tutorial anyway. But what I had to do was I had to go to where this file is actually located. Let's go to cd user local MySQL, which is where it happens to be located on my Mac, and it could be different for yours. And it's really just a kind of dummy configuration file. And if we look at it, it's pretty simple. It's just most of these options are just comments, or they're just commented out. But what I did do, what I've already done here, I've added this myself because at least in my version here, it didn't already exist. I've added this option, default storage engine equals my ISAM. So this is how you can configure it if you want to. So on my Mac, the actual location that this file is really read from is in /etc. And of course it's going to be different on different systems. So you have to Google this if you want to do it. So here's my my.cnf, or it will be my.ini on Windows. I'm going to do sudo via my.cnf. So I'm just using some Unix commands that I'm familiar with already, but you could edit this in any editor, as long as you have to make sure it's not read-only, otherwise you're not going to be able to save it. And let's first check that there isn't already a default storage engine option in there, and there isn't here. So let's add it. In fact, let's stop the server first. Let's go to system preferences, and I'm going to stop the MySQL server. if I get the right admin password for my Mac, it will really help a lot. More haste and less speed. Okay, so I've stopped it. Now I'm going to put in here default storage engine, just like I edited the non-working demo version, but now I'm really editing the version that's actually being used. So I'm going to put my ISAM right in here in this MySQL D section. So I've saved that, and I'm going to start my server again. Let's go to System Preferences, Start MySQL Server. Then I'll go back to my MySQL Workbench, and I'm going to quit this tab because it's probably still not working. Reopen the connection, and I'm going to do Show Engines. We don't actually have to do Use Database before Show Engines, because Show Engines doesn't apply to a particular database. And we can see here that my ISAM is set to the default. So before I do anything else, I'm going to set it back to InnoDB, because InnoDB is the one, at least at the moment, that you really want to be using. So I'm just going to comment this out with a hash sign, which is a comment symbol. That just turns this into a line that's not going to be actually read. And I probably should have stopped the server really before I edited it, but in any case I'm going to stop it now and restart it, and we're going to go to the workbench when it's running, do Show Engines. Probably I need to reopen a connection, Show Engines, and now we see InnoDB is the default again. So now the thing that you really want to take away from this tutorial is you need to do Show Engines and check that InnoDB is the default for your system. If it isn't, and you are the administrator of your server, you can change the default in a config file, and that will make sure that even after you restart the server, InnoDB will remain the default. If you're not the administrator, you have a choice between either using set default storage engine. Set storage engine is what it used to be, but now it's set default storage engine equals InnoDB. You could use that, but you have to remember to do it every time you open a connection to MySQL. Or you could specify it every time after you create a table, like create table test id int engine equals InnoDB. But that's kind of a lot of hassle. So if you're lucky, just do Show Engines and you'll find it is the default already. Okay, that's it for this tutorial. Until next time, happy coding.